Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Subhash Kotra, Developer Relations Engineer at Lambda Test, and I will be host for this session. It's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker for this session, Subhash Kotra, who will shed light on a fascinating topic of enhancing backend microservice ecosystem with contract testing. In this talk, we will explore the dynamic world of backend microservices and the pivotal role of contract testing. Our expert guide Subhash brings almost 2 decades of experience in software testing and engineering. Get ready for real world examples, insights into challenges, and practical applications of contract testing for rapid development and enhanced team collaborations. His commitment to high quality products and proactive exploration of emerging technologies promises a workshop of full actionable insights. Please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A section on the left. And at the end of the session, we will be taking all the questions. And also make sure you encourage the speaker and the session by using the emojis down below. Now let's transform how we design, develop, and deploy this ever evolving domain. Now please join me in welcoming Subhash Kotra. Hi Subhash, how are you?
Hey, Sparsh. Let me start sharing my screen and we go about it. Cool. Hope you guys are seeing my screen. And yeah, thank you so much, Sparsh. That introduction was really awesome. I might not have been able to create my own introduction of that sort. Thank you. With that, let us now delve into the topic of enhancing the backend microservices ecosystem with contract testing. As Persh mentioned, just a bit more about me if you just want to know. I am Subhash Kotra, automation lead at Tide.co, based out of Hyderabad, living with my wife and 2 kids. Close to 17 plus years of solving automation challenges, primarily into open source tools and frameworks. I'm a recent Cambridge alumni, marathon runner, regular marathon runner at it, and of course the Lambda Test Spartan, which you can see here. I'm part of Tide.co. Some of you who are from India might be thinking whether Tide is a detergent powder. No, it's not. We are a global business financial platform, which officially founded in 2015 in the UK, but launched our product in 2017 in the UK. What do? We are, like I said, a leading business financial platform, right? So we try to solve these small and medium business owners myriad tasks that they do on a day-to-day basis. We have been growing at a very rapid scale, and that's why we call ourselves as a fintech scale-up. So we are now have achieved 10% share in the UK market, which is close to 575,000 members in the UK. We have also launched in India, which is more than a year into India, and we have already crossed 200,000 members in India. I'm really proud to say that. We also have the engineering team spread across the globe, just like the Spartan Summit, which is across the globe from all over the world. We have people who work for us, work with us in the engineering team all across the world from remote, but primarily from our offices in UK, Bulgaria, that's Sofia, and India. With that, now let's look at contract testing and how we can enhance our backend microsystems. I hope we all of us know what is microservices and how does it help us in moving towards the greater architecture of the systems altogether. So we're going above that. Let's now try to see what exactly are contracts. Before we go into the contract testing, we should understand what are contracts, right? So contracts are basically sort of an agreement that is created from a particular microservice, and it can be created from both the schema and the key perspectives that the endpoint or the microservice has. It is an agreement, like I said, as the communication pattern between the different microservices. And it defines rules, protocols, and expectations, just like any agreement will have. Just like when you join an organization or you join this summit, you do have set of rules, protocols, and expectations that you need to follow to adhere to your job prospects. Similarly, the microservices also will have a specified contract which it should adhere to, so that the other microservices or the front-end client that is trying to talk to this microservice is able to talk in the same language that the microservice expects it to. Let's try to look into it in a bit more with a different example as such. Let's consider there's a service called as A. I'm just taking the hypothetical name as A. And imagine that there are three other microservices, which is like B, C, and D. The B, C, and D microservices, for some of their endpoints, they talk to service A. Assume that, and also assume that as part of the service A, I try to make some modifications that came in as a requirement to me in my current sprint. And I forgot to update whole of my organization or whole of the community that this is the change that is intended or coming up in this sprint. So how do the services B, C, and D, or any other front-end client that is trying to talk to this service, know whether I have made these changes? Obviously, they will not be aware of that, and they'll continue to use the same microservice and they use the same endpoints in the same way that they were using it earlier. Needless to say, what happens next? The endpoints that are being used in B, C, and D gets failed, and often when does it fail? Basically, when we try to do it as an end-to-end test. We try to make a call of an end-to-end test, be it an API end-to-end test, or more specifically on the client side end-to-end tests. And we try to perform an action on the client and then see that something is broken up, right? Obviously, it is costly because the services have built up, the client has built up, product is about to launch, and then you find out an issue, you have to go back, fix it, you have to come back and fix your release cycles and all those stuff. And that's where the contract testing would help us in identifying or fixing the issues much earlier in the entire release cycle. So you have a contract test, and you mentioned that service B, C, and D, which you can see over here, are calling an endpoint which is there in service A. You make a change, and as soon as you make a change, all of your contract tests run on A, and as part of your pipelines, the CI pipelines, the services B, C, and D also run their contract tests. So at that moment, the service B would give a call to the service endpoint that is being there in A, and immediately find out that service B has a failure there. And let's assume that Sparsh was working on the service B there. He immediately flags off saying that there is an issue there, and then talks to me, and I can then communicate that this is the problem and this is what needs to be fixed, and that's how it is done. Basically fixing a manual error that shouldn't be there at the right place. Let's try to maybe dig deeper and then see. Basically try to understand from our testing pyramid per se. We all know what is testing pyramid and what goes in at the bottom of the testing pyramid. Obviously, the unit tests, right? And right at the top of the unit test in the traditional testing pyramid comes the integration test. And at the top, right at the top, with a very small percentage, we assume or we try to make the end-to-end test, which should be the lowest priority of it, because to make sure that we are not dependent on UI flaky tests, which are quite often, and then delay the complete release cycles. To make it more effective, I propose that we introduce an intermediary step right between the unit and integration tests, which we all call it as contract tests. So this contract test and the automation of this would help us in identifying the changes much earlier in the release cycle, just as I was explaining it earlier. This also acts as a safety net during the deployments, and it gives us some confidence in introducing some changes. Otherwise, like I was discussing in my case, say I don't have a contract test and I'm not that confident in terms of making this change which is going on to the release cycle. And it just adds up to that, okay, I can make this change confidently because the contractors are there to handle that and then make sure that, the whole organization is adhering to that. And that is why I call contract test is the imperative piece in the whole testing pyramid or the backend microservices testing ecosystem. So now let's look at what are the different components that make contract test. So contract test, as you had seen in the previous slide, it's just above the unit test, so which is much more closer to the unit test, right? So it should have a different, more technological terms of the formation of the components that goes into a contract test. The first component that I call it as is consumer. Rather, that's what the pact advises us. Consumers are Consumer tests are basically the tests that generate and store some of the expectations or the agreements that we just discussed earlier. And this particular agreement is then can be used by the different providers. It can be the services or the front-end client. And that's the second component, which is provider. Providers are the services which use these consumers and validate these contracts. Like in our example earlier, Spursh, Spursh's service, microservice, becomes the provider and my service becomes the consumer. So when Spursh's microservice makes a call to my service, it typically is validating the service contract file that was generated while doing the consumer part. So how does all this happen? There should be some sort of an integration piece, or there should be some sort of a central piece that you make a communication between the providers, all the different providers. It can, in the diagram that I showed, it was just 3, but in a real world organization, it can be much more. I'll come to that later on. So how do we kind of communicate between all those providers and the consumers? These providers can also then in turn become consumers for different other providers, right? There should be something, and that's the most important component of the contract test, which is the pact broker. The pact broker is a centrally located storage, as I was mentioned in the slide, which maintains all the contracts or all the contract files that gets generated from the consumer tests. So typically what happens is, let's assume there's a pact broker here. There's a consumer that generates the contract file. This contract file is then stored on the pact broker. There are a set of providers which are available. This provider has to talk to the pact broker, get the contract file of the consumer of the service A, validate whether the contracts that the providers are calling up or making use of, to make sure that the same contract file and or the contract that the providers have is matching with the newer contract that is getting published from the consumers. So that's how it all works in the complete ecosystem. So pact broker, how do you set up all of this, right? So you can set the pact broker using all by yourself, using all of the AWS ecosystem. AWS does provide us, the cloud infrastructure and everything that you can put all of your pact broker details there. Make sure that everything is available there, and then configure it accordingly so that the communication between the consumers, providers, front-end clients, back-end microservices, everything happens. That is definitely cumbersome, but it's sort of an open source in the terminology per se, right? So there is also an open source ecosystem that is already created and is provided by pact.io. You can refer back to it after going after this session. You can go back to the pact.io. It does give us in terms of the complete system of how do you configure the pact broker, then make sure that the communication is happening between the consumers and providers. So I feel that using this, which is also an open source, right? You don't have to set up all of the systems for using AWS, you can definitely go to the pack broker, get it through the pack.io, and make sure that your communication happens, and that's the central place. So what I personally feel is this sort of a design using the pack.io consumers, products, providers, and the contractors would definitely revolutionize on how we work with contractors, or how we work with the overall testing pyramid in the upcoming years that are coming into the testing pyramid per se. So there are, for sure, must be some very key aspects in terms of how do we define contracts. So it is like we were discussing, right? These are the rules, and these are the set of expectations that the contracts must go or adhere to. So so you have to first define, or you have to first kind of design that these are the set of rules that you would want to accomplish. And I would probably like to pull back. There can be many, but what I feel is the initial part. Some of them are these API designs, like how do you kind of design your complete structure in terms of how and what methods go into your endpoints, whether are you using all of the endpoint methods, all of the microservices like get, put, post, update methods, or are you using only get methods for your microservice? Like that, you design your request and response mechanisms, and sort of that. And then comes the payload structure in terms of how do you structure your requests and responses, what sort of how do you structure the data flow between the different microservices. Then, of course, the data formats in terms of what sort of data formats do you use. Are you using JSON? Are you using XML? Some might be comfortable with JSON, some might be comfortable with XML. So you have to adhere to those standards, come together, like Larry was explaining in the earlier session, right? So show empathy, talk to the different systems, talk to the different stakeholders, get that agreement, which data format you would like to use in the organization, JSON, XML, and stuff. Similarly, the versioning, of course, there can be one contract file that I just generated, which is 1.0. The next time that then when you update that, you have to version that, and the providers that are trying to call this contract also have to understand that there's a new version that's coming up, but they also should have the luxury to work with a earlier version, right, which is the backend compatibility that we call it is in our terms, right? So versioning is definitely very important in terms of having the right versions present in the pack broker and update accordingly to the providers. Of course, in today's world, which is fast moving, the security and authentication becomes very, very critical in terms of what sort of authentication mechanisms that we use. Do we use the JWT approach? Do we use the OAuth approach? Do we use any other protocols that are available to safeguard our microservices? How the call happens between microservice A to B and stuff like that. And then in this list, it is mentioned as a last point, but in my opinion, it is much above the last point, right? So it is the monitoring and the logging part. So we do have all the services. We do communicate with the different services, make calls to all of them. If there's no monitoring and no logging, how would we be able to ensure that the right call happens from service B to A? So that's why the logging things is very critical. I'll take a pause here for any questions. I know Sparsh had mentioned that I'll take questions at the end, but if there are any on the spot questions, I'll take a pause for a second.
Subhash, shall I pick up some questions?
Yeah, you can.
Uh,
I
the first
see
question,
something on the chat. Sorry, go ahead.
The first question from Jalpa Gandhi. Can you recommend a couple of key tools or frameworks for implementing contract testing in microservices?
Right. So like I was telling you, so pack.io is an open source GitHub framework. Let me share. Are you still seeing my screen or is just the questions?
Yeah, your screen was blue.
Cool. So if you can see this, so Pact Foundation has given us the complete ecosystem of the Pact.io. It is, it has given us the the in terms of how do you want to talk to the contracts, generate the contracts and stuff. So you can use this an open source tool. Of course, you can implement your own part of this. And as Daniel was mentioning earlier, Gen AI and AI is the talk of the town. So there are some Gen AI companies that are coming up in terms of generating these contract tests using AI automatically. So Pack.io is definitely one that is suggestible. Gen AI, it's still upcoming. I'll have to wait to answer that.
Uh, Thank you, Subhash. I'm just picking up the question which was on the chat. As a quality team member, how we can start to implement in our organization? Just if you can give me some process steps which helps us, how can we start from root?
Right. Good question, Madhavi. So basically, you try to understand what is your current infrastructure, what are your current testing principles in your organization. Take the next step in terms of course, you would not have the contract test at the start. You will have unit and integration and end-to-end. Then you pick out what kind of bugs are getting identified in the end-to-end test, or of course not on the production for sure, hopefully, but not on the end-to-end test. You might see some of the bugs that are coming up. So at that moment, you go back, identify the data points, and see that these tests could have, or these bugs could have been caught much earlier in if you had the release cycle. So you gathered all of that data, put a tags to that, showcase to your stakeholders in the organization, and tell them that this is the bug that could have been identified over here, and then you convince them and try to implement that particular part. Hope that is your question, if I read it correctly. It's on my other screen, so I'm just reading it out again. Good. Thank you. Okay, so coming back, yes, Push.
We can take the rest of and the.
Sure. So coming back to where we are, right, in terms of the defining the contracts and these steps. I do not have a detailed demo, but what I would like to showcase is basically the pack.io and of course the Spring Boot, because not the interview questions that is coming up here, but so basically contract test, as we were seeing, it is at the very lower level of test, right? So definitely you'll have to be very familiar with Spring Boot. So the first prerequisite would be for you to be able to understand Spring Boot, Spring mechanisms, how annotations work, how you can work with Spring Boot in terms of getting there. Then pack.io does suggest or support different code languages. It can be Java, it can be Node.js, it can be JavaScript and stuff. This is an example of JVM, which is of course Java, and you can utilize maybe Java services or anything else. Once you come to if able to find out which specific programming language that you would want to like this, you just go to pack.io and go to the specific documentation. In my case, I am coming here with the JVM documentation, and scroll down over there and see what exactly is the latest version of support that the pack.io is giving. With respect to the JDK 17 plus, JDK version of 17 and plus, you need to get the dependency of 4.6 as they suggest, right? So this is all present as either a Maven project or a Gradle project, whichever you prefer in your organization. Take the appropriate version of the supported pack.io dependency from Maven repository, add that Maven onto your pom.xml or your build.gradle if you're using Gradle. And that's it. Understand Spring Boot's how does the Spring Boot system works, how does annotation work, Spring Boot test works, and provide the exact. I'm just going back to the slide to show you the same path over here. So provide the exact name of the consumer that you would like to communicate with. This is very critical because in the pack broker that you see here, it identifies the specific consumers and the providers by an annotation in Spring Boot and pack.io recommended annotation is packed test for. So you mentioned that this pack test is for the service A. So you give that name over there, and the same name you have to provide while you are writing your provider tests. Provider tests are also sort of a unit test, which you should write it using Spring Boot, and JUnit is suggestible. Again, you go back here, and it is mentioned as you can use any of the other parts. What I recommend is definitely JUnit 5, which you can see here. JUnit and JUnit 5 are the two mostly widely accepted Java-based unit testing frameworks. JUnit 5 is more latest, so better to use JUnit 5 in this case. And make sure that the namings work or the nomenclature works accordingly with respect to the pack broker consumers and providers, how the communication is happening over there. So if you see the pack.io documentation here, okay, I didn't realize they were also using the microservices ABC nomenclature here, but this is how they call it as. So the front-end client could be Android, iOS, web, or anything of that sort. The same website that I just gave it a hit, this would also have an endpoint at the back, right? So in that case, the front-end client would be the desktop or the browser. So this particular communication is important, and that's how you work. With respect to real world example, I can definitely give an example of my organization and the earlier organization that I was working on. So, and it can be very well related to all of you people also, is that imagine or assume that there is a support portal in your for your product and this support product talks to all of the different other components of your product. For say you have a payment mechanism wherein the actual customer or member, in our Tides terminology we call customers as member. So a member is trying to make a payment using our mobile app. He faces some issue, and then he'll get a probably a tagline which says if you're facing issue, click here to navigate to support. So he clicks on the support and goes to the support chat where he or she can basically try to enter something and try to get the support from our operations team at the backend. However, we assume that the microservices team of the support feature of the product made some changes. They just moved in from a vendor A to vendor B. This actually happened basically. And while the movement of vendor A and B had happened, the support team did not communicate it to payments team, as an example. Then the endpoints had completely changed because we have changed the vendors from A to B, and the endpoint that the payments team were calling earlier are no longer working, and it just throws you 404, right? And that's when you identify When do you identify? When you are doing manual testing or when you are doing the automation testing of the end-to-end tests. You have to go back, fix all of that, release a new product, and all that stuff is included. This actually happened a lot of times in the earlier organizations that are there. Thankfully, at Tide, the communication is much more simpler. Obviously, we are scaling up, and at the moment when we are like 1,600 plus employees right now, uh, the communication is easier. But talk about bigger organizations, there are people must be who are coming from bigger organizations. Uh, the communication might be much more difficult, and that's where the contractors would be really helpful in my opinion. And that's all from my side. I thank you everyone for having me. I'm open to take any further questions.
Thank you, Subhash. We'll be picking up some more questions. Uh, as a beginner, what initial steps or resources do you recommend for starting contract testing? Asked by Kalyan.
Right. So, Kalyani, first thing is to understand the microservices. What are microservices? How a microservice is built up? Like, there's a controller and there is, everybody talks with the controller. Controller in microservices is the terminology, is basically uh, the controller of the complete system, right? That's where when you hit an endpoint, say let's say slash search query. So when you do a slash search query endpoint, hit a slash search query endpoint, it goes to the controller of the microservice. So first step would be to understand the microservices, how the controllers are built up, how that controller is then talking to the repository. The repository where all of the data gets stored, and understand that system, and then understand what sort of contracts are being generated, and then you take the next steps of going to the pack.io or going to other new age gen AI tools that are trying to generate these contractors.
Thank you, Subhash. I hope that answers your question. There are some more questions about how to get started. I hope uh, that answers your questions as well. Picking up the next question asked by Devashish, how will you suggest to handle cases where API call to the provider is being made by a common library that is being used in multiple services and consumers? Are there any ways to avoid repeating the same test in all consumers?
Yes, Devashish. So that's where the pack broker comes into the picture. And like you said, there can be different providers, and the providers then can also be consumers for some other providers, right? So the pack broker configuration becomes important in terms of you configure that consumer A is present over here, and when a request to consumer A's endpoint happens, you talk to that and you go to that particular endpoint, so that in say in the microservice D, which is calling, let's say, C, and the C is calling A, so you don't have to write duplicate tests at the D, because you're calling the pack broker, getting the contract from the pack broker of A. So that's where that's how you probably kind of avoid the mistakes of repeating the tests.
Thank you, Subhash. Um, Question asked by Gridhar is what's the difference between contract testing and schema validation between consumers and providers?
Right, very common question that often comes up. Schema validation just validates the schema in terms of, like, is my screen share still there?
Yes, Subhash.
Right. Okay, so imagine not on this. Okay. Right. So let's say, imagine you have an XML data format, which has the this is the or the JSON data format, wherein the schema is present in terms of the tags, different tags, tag uh, in the search query, say tag A, tag B, tag C, and that's how the schema is present. It doesn't validate what is the key and what is the value that is inside the that particular tag of A. The contract test tries to identify or understand, make sure that the response that is coming from the search query is exact match of the value that is expected out of the endpoint, right? Let's say, if you take it a, a bit more in terms of, there's an endpoint which returns a result of summation of two numbers. So the schema validation would only validate whether schema A has schema A and schema B is there, or the tags A and B is there, and the sum is present as an output or not. The contract test actually validates whether the endpoint is in fact making sure that the sum is working fine, and instead of sum, the result is not giving you as an difference. So that's the failure, right? So if, say, it is giving you A minus B instead of A plus B, then it's a problem. That is not identified using schema validation, but that is identified using contract test. Hope that answers.
Thank you, Subhash. I think that answers it. The next question asked by Bhanu is testing across various versions. Testing becomes more complex when multiple versions of microservice running concurrently. How do we tackle such cases, as it is very challenging when there are several services?
Right. So, like I was explaining in my slide earlier, versioning is definitely very critical in terms of how you maintain your contracts. How do you validate that? So, as soon as there's a new version that gets published to the pack broker, so the providers have to communicate to this pack broker and see that which version is being pulled up, right? So that's where the communication piece is important within your organization, that there's a new version that has pushed up, right? So if you do not communicate between each other, and I'll again pick up Larry, because his session was really insightful, as we all agree. So if you do not communicate between yourself, as Larry was explaining, you are bound to get into failures, right? So as a member of your microservice, you have to communicate there's a new version. You don't need to communicate the whole service, the whole schema, the changes in the endpoint. These are the changes. All that part you don't need to tell them. With the help of contractors, you can just tell them that there's a new version, pick it up. So that's how you kind of manage that.
Thank you, Subhash. Next question asked by Alban is, what are the benefits of contract testing as compared to traditional integration testing methodologies?
So the traditional integration testing methodologies are more in terms of validating the integration points between service A or service B, or the client and the service A, whereas the contractors are much more closer to the unit tests. You're not doing an integration of service A and B. In fact, I might have missed in my presentation, you can actually mock the other endpoints, the external endpoints in the contract test, which doesn't make sense to you. You are validating only whether the service endpoint A is giving you the valid output that it is expected to. You're not worried about a third party, like, for example, in let's pick up our Indian system, where you are talking to Aadhaar, you're doing an uh, ID verification in your bank, and it talks to Aadhaar. So what you are doing in your contract test is whether your service that is responsible to give the response of ID verification, yes or no. You're not validating whether the UADI site in the Aadhaar is giving the valid response or not. You are assuming that that's the government website, it does work all the time. That's the assumption that you go in with, and you are just testing your services. So I would say that the contract tests are actually unit tests and not the integration tests. And you give that additional step of validations before you reach the integration test. Hope that answers Albin.
Thank you, Subhash. Just picking up the last question, how can we ensure that contractors remain relevant and up to date as microservices involve?
Again, using the pack broker and the pack.io concepts, if I'm trying to understand the question correctly, Rudy. So using the GenAI, new age GenAI tools, and you have to update each and every time. It's a if you are not using the GenAI tools, it's a big manual task that you write all of these tests manually. I mean, I would definitely refer you to go to an Udemy course by Mr. Rohit Shetty. That's how I learned contract testing way back, and it is definitely a very insightful course on Udemy. So what he demonstrates in that course is basically writing a contract test physically, manually over a period of time. And it does take a lot of time for you to write all of the contract tests for all the endpoints that you have in your organization. That's how the new age use GenAI, as Daniel was suggesting. Improve your efficiency. Use that GenAI to generate your contract tests, and over a period of time, just update to that and make sure that you're up to speed to the industry.
Thank you so much, Subhash. Thank you for answering questions. Thank you all for paying attention to the very interesting topic. There are some questions left. Make sure you are following our community threads. We will be answering these questions, and we will also take help from Subhash so that he can also put up his views as well. Thank you all for joining. Make sure you follow Subhash on LinkedIn and other social media channels. You can reach out to him directly if you are having any doubts in contract testing or would want his suggestions. Thank you all. Thanks, Subhash.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.